Okay, welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Frank Place. I work with the Policies, Institutions, and Markets program, and I'm moderating this webinar on behalf of Karen Brooks, who's away from the office, but it may perhaps joining us online. Welcome and thank you for joining this PIM webinar. It's our fourth webinar in our 2017 series. And it's the second one from one of our flagships, flagship 2, which is on economy-wide factors affecting agricultural growth and rural transformations. And today's topic is what determines public budgets for agricultural growth in the developing world. And I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Tewodaj Mogues. Tewodaj is a senior research fellow in IFPRI's Development Strategy and Governance Division, and she also leads PIM's research cluster on public investments and institutions. Her research interests include public investments in rural areas, local public finance and decentralization, political economy, public service delivery, and social capital. Much of her empirical research has been on Ethiopia, Ghana, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Uganda. Dr. Mogues received her bachelor's degree in economics from Kalamazoo College in 1995 and her PhD in agricultural and applied economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2005. So before I hand it over to Tewodaj, I would just like to explain how we will proceed in the webinar. Our speaker will begin very shortly with a presentation that you'll see on your screen. The presentation will last for about 30 minutes. During the presentation, we invite all you listeners to send in questions via the chat and question windows on the right side of your screens. I hope you can find those. We will collate the questions and group any that are similar in content, and then we'll be posing those to Tewodaj, and she'll address the questions. We are handling the questions in this way to make the best use of our 1 hour together. We are also recording the webinar, and we'll make it available on our website shortly after the live event for those unable to join us now or would like a replay. Okay, with that in mind, I hand it over to Tewodaj to help us understand better what determines public budgets for agricultural growth in the developing world.
Thank you so much, Frank, for this introduction, and thank you to all that you're attending. I'm really happy to be presenting a body of work on public expenditures in and for agriculture that, in my presentation, will ultimately culminate in trying to answer this very question on the title slide that you see: what determines public expenditures or public budgets for agricultural growth in the developing world? Despite the phrase here, developing world, I'll be presenting findings from across developing countries, but I'll really be having a focus on Africa, as you will see in a bit. Okay, so public investments are generally understood to be a central element of the policy toolkit that governments have to support agricultural productivity. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that that is the only way that governments can act. There are a range of property rights regimes and property rights policies that they can institute, regulatory policies. They can improve the reform or the structure of the public sector to better serve agriculture. But this is certainly the focus of this presentation, to be looking at public expenditure allocations, which can affect agriculture in multiple ways. And obviously, I can't cover possibly all of the different ways, but just to give a flavor and an example, public expenditures can improve the education and, in a sense, the skill quality and the quantity of agricultural extension workers, as well as can provide the equipment that they actually need to be effective in reaching farmers. Expenditures can also be responsible for providing the roads in rural areas, both in terms of density as well as quality, that farmers need in order to get their products to markets and also to access inputs. And of course, when we think of agriculture, we're not only concerned with the production stage, but also along the value chain. Agro-processors are an important type of agent in the agricultural realm, and they would need reliable energy supply that also public expenditures can provide in order to operate, for example, their mills or other types of equipment. So these are obviously just a few examples. And I want to start out by saying that there's a lot of crucial economic research and other types of social science research that is concerned with analyzing the impacts on farmers' welfare and farmers' livelihoods of individual agricultural projects and individual types of interventions. But in this presentation, I want to be taking more of a 30,000-foot view of public expenditures in agriculture. And I want to ask and hopefully address the following sets of questions, which also leads me now to giving you a quick outline of the presentation. So the first question is, how much is actually spent in order to support agricultural productivity growth? Secondly, are these expenditures actually worth it? Or in other ways, what are the impacts of public expenditures on agricultural productivity, but also beyond that on other indicators of welfare? And this third question is the one that relates most closely to what you saw as the title of the whole presentation, namely, what factors actually determine how public finances are allocated to agriculture versus other sectors, and also within agriculture, and ultimately for food security. And finally, I want to conclude with a few early thoughts and early reflections on what we can learn by way of potential avenues to improve the allocation of spending. Okay, with that, let's go straight to the first question. How much do governments actually spend to support agriculture? So there are many different ways that this can be quantified and examined. I want to start with what I think is a reasonable first cut way to look at the quantification of agricultural spending. And that is to look at agricultural public expenditures as a share of total spending or total budgets. So what you see here is a map generated by the SPEED tool. SPEED stands for Statistics on Public Expenditures for Economic Development, which is a tool supported by PIM and is also publicly available, and these types of maps can be easily generated. So it shows in different shades of blue, in this case, the share of spending that goes to agriculture across different countries. But this is certainly just like a snapshot in time. So let's take a look at how this pans out over time, especially over the long term. So again, using SPEED, we can see here the long-term trend in Sub-Saharan Africa of the share of public budgets that go to agriculture. And what we find, despite fluctuations, especially in the 1980s, is that there's, in a sense, a long-term decline from around 11% in the early 80s, 10 to 11%, going all the way down to around 5% of total budgets that are allocated to agriculture. These are averages across all countries. Now there are, in the recent years, as you can see in the 2000s, kind of a gentle increase again. And one can speculate in some ways what could be contributing to this increase. And this is very much a speculation, so this is not based on any firm evidence, but it's interesting to see that in the year 2003, the African Union established in the Maputo Declaration a set of guidelines for African countries to allocate 10% of their budgets to agriculture. This coincides with sort of the beginning of the increase, at least temporary increase. Now, again, I want to be very cautious here to say that this is in no way causal. I'll actually come back to this toward the end of the presentation. What we also see in the latter part of this gentle increase for a short time period is, of course, the well-known food price increases that many countries have undergone, not only in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll stop there with these, somewhat speculative remarks and go on to say, to ask the question, is this long-term decline an African phenomenon, or is this something that we see across developing regions? So here we're superimposing a number of other developing regions, as you can see: East Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, South Asia. And generally speaking, of course, there are ups and downs and different degrees of fluctuation, but we see overall that there is this long-term decline in support to agriculture, measured in this particular way. Now, this particular measure may not be fully adequate to understand whether this is really a declining support to the sector, because it could well be that the role of agriculture is also declining in the economy, so then it may not be as surprising that public expenditure levels will also decline in agriculture. So we're taking a look here at agricultural public expenditure intensity, which means here as a ratio to agricultural GDP. And so first looking again at Sub-Saharan Africa, we find again, actually in this case, a fairly precipitous, certainly fluctuating even more than before, fluctuating but precipitous decline in agricultural public expenditure intensity, especially in the 1980s, ultimately flattening out again with variations up and down. In this case, when we compare it with other regions, with a few exceptions, we find that the African trend is somewhat unique. So you see a more or less flat, at least again for most regions, a more or less flat intensity over the long term from the 1980 to the 30-year period that we have the data for. Now, finally, I want to take one more look at this question by way of asking, is the decline in agricultural spending something that is perhaps more rapid in this sector, but is actually seen across all sectors? So essentially, is there a decline in public spending, period? And in order to look at that, we examine total public expenditure intensity, which is total public spending as a ratio to the size of the economy or GDP. And again, here what we see, so red is just like before the Sub-Saharan African line, and then the other regions, again with some fluctuations and some differences across the regions, we actually see a pretty flat trend in public expenditures. The downward trend in agriculture is in no way mirrored across the board by total spending. Okay, so that was a first look at total spending in agriculture in different ways, right? Now I want to single out a particular type of agricultural spending, namely spending on research and development or science and technology. The reason I'm doing that, I have to anticipate a little bit the subsequent results I'll be showing on the analytical returns to spending. The reason I'm taking a look at spending trends in R&D is because R&D found across a number of studies shown to have dramatically higher returns for agricultural productivity, but also for welfare indicators. So because of this, it is actually worth seeing what level of support there is to research in agriculture. So the first way we look at this is similar to what we saw earlier on intensity. So here intensity will mean the share or the ratio of agricultural R&D spending in Africa in this case. So I'll be focusing a bit more on Africa now, to the ratio of R&D spending to agricultural GDP. And this is reliant on data, excuse me, from the Agricultural Science and Technology Indicators, which is an initiative led by IFPRI and supported by PIM, and led by Nienke Biantema, but a number of researchers are involved with ASTI. So first look for about a decade and a half period for which the data are of sufficient quantity that they can be aggregated across Sub-Saharan Africa. What we see here is that intensity in R&D has seen a steady, not a dramatic, but certainly a steady decline from the year 2000 till the latest period that we have, which is 2014. Now, that still leaves the question open. It may have declined, but is it high? Is this something that we can consider a high level of intensity or low level intensity? There's certainly many questions many ways to address this question, but I'm going to first take the approach that I mentioned earlier, which is the African Union's guideline. So the African Union had given a guideline on the share of spending in agriculture. Similarly, it has also laid down a guideline for ag R&D intensity, also motivated by earlier work done by the United Nations. And this R&D intensity ratio that African countries were encouraged to try to reach was 1%. So we see that, as you can see here, let's see if I can move my mouse and see it right up here. So you can see that certainly the actual R&D intensity falls quite short of this. Another way to look at a very similar measure, essentially, is to examine, in this case, over the long term, so looking at a sort of 4 time periods spanning about 3 decades, the share of countries that have met this 1% R&D spending intensity level. So this share has declined from over 50%, about 55% of countries in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, in 1984, down to a bit above 40%, and then a bit above 30%, and finally in 2014, for the latest data point that we have, just 17%. So there's been a steady decline in support to R&D, however we look at this. Okay, so now we get to the second question. Like I said, are expenditures worth it in agriculture and in R&D? Before I get to analytical results, I just want to give a quick picture that shows the correlation, a simple bivariate correlation between agriculture R&D expenditure growth, which is on the horizontal axis, and ag GDP growth. And here we have lagged the ag expenditure growth. So this is correlating, let's say, last year's ag R&D expenditure to growth to this year's ag GDP growth. And you see the small gray points, which are really a dusting of many different data points because they cover the 30-year period for all African countries. So, and then this is a fitted trend line that you can see in blue. So we see that there's practically no correlation, or very, very mild positive correlation, when we have this 1-year lag. When we look at a 6-year lag, we actually see a more distinct positive correlation. And this is suggestive, and certainly very cautious suggestive evidence, that there is a long gestation period of ag R&D investments until they bear fruit. Now, again, I want to be very cautious, and we'll come to some descriptive, we'll come to some more analytical results after these descriptives, but this is also very consistent with what many in the R&D community know, that it takes many, many years from expenditures being incurred until improved varieties being developed, and then even more time until farmers actually adopt these new varieties. This is important to actually mention because this motivates what the number of studies that I'll be presenting do in their analysis of R&D returns. They look at lagged R&D as well as more recent R&D's impact on various measures, various outcome measures. So it is important to actually account for this lag. Okay, so let me start with a study that was undertaken a little while back, but it's an interesting study because it's a meta-analysis of some 370 analyses that were undertaken across different developing regions to look at the internal rates of return to agricultural R&D. So what this graph shows is the share from these 374 studies, the share of studies that focus on Africa that have IRRs, or internal rates of return, between 0 and 20, which is about 27% or so of these studies. And as you look at the red bars and go to the right, you see that a substantial number of studies actually still find pretty high rates of return. Around 75% of all the Africa-related studies show rates of return, internal rates of return above 20%. So these are really very healthy rates by any measure, and it's quite similar also for other regions, if not even more pronounced. Okay, so I want to focus a little bit on some country-level analyses, because the difference between these country-level analyses and what I had presented earlier is that they actually compare the returns to spending on R&D with returns to spending on other sectors that are often deemed very important for agricultural productivity, for income increases, poverty reduction, etc. So this is a study, for example, by Schengen Fan and Chabot in 2008 that looked in Uganda at the dollar-for-dollar marginal returns that emerge from R&D, that's the area in the red oval, compared with returns to roads, returns to education spending, returns to health spending, etc. What we see here is that R&D returns are not only really high, these are marginal returns again, where you see that for the extra dollar spent on R&D, you get $12 increase in agricultural productivity, but they're also higher than other important sectoral spending areas. And the same counts for poverty reduction impacts. Again, the highest levels of impacts are achieved in R&D. So this is the case of Uganda. When we look at Tanzania, a study by Schengen and a number of other colleagues, here the examination is a comparison of R&D returns to, again, other non-agricultural returns but not in productivity terms, but in household income, in terms of increases in household income. So again, you see that R&D spending is significant, not always the highest, as you see with poverty reduction, but continues to be significant in comparison. And finally, this is not, these are not findings of returns to spending, but it's actually quite interesting since we're still on R&D. So a fairly recent study by Alejandro and Prat has used the data envelopment analysis method to examine the gap between actual expenditures in R&D and expenditures that would be attained. The definition of what would be attained is quite complex in the analysis, but just to mention that it accounts for countries' size, countries' agricultural GDP, their total GDP, and a number of other variables. So the details will be captured in the paper, but what it shows, if you look at the bar on the first graph, I'm moving my mouse over here, in the period from 2000 to 2011, 2001 to 2011, so around the 10-year period, there is an investment gap of about 5 billion in purchasing power parity dollars. So that is quite significant. Okay, so I will move on to talking about total agriculture, returns to total agriculture. As you recall, I showed the trends in total agriculture spending as well as in R&D, and now I'm doing the same for the analytical work. So, and again, focusing on country studies in Africa. So here, this is a study using computable general equilibrium analysis, a different approach from econometric work, but still very important. And it looks here at the returns to budget investments in total agriculture, but also commodity spending on commodity. I'm not going to go into the individual commodities here. So if we just sort of focus on the figure that you see in the dark red box, you see that the dollar for dollar returns to spending in agriculture as a whole are still high. So $3 increase in agriculture value added for the dollar spent, but not as high as some of the findings we saw earlier in the case of R&D returns. Okay, and similarly in the case of Ghana, this is back to econometric analysis. The returns to agricultural public expenditure, total agricultural public expenditures in Ghana, are kind of in the ballpark of what we just saw in Rwanda, around 3.5. Again, high, but not as high as R&D returns. And finally, the case of Ethiopia, which has actually had very high levels of spending. We weren't able to see that since we didn't disaggregate by country, but Ethiopia has spent a tremendous amount on agriculture. And here, actually, we see that additional marginal expenditures on agriculture do not have a statistically significant impact on rural incomes. Note that here the outcome measures rural income, not agricultural productivity. And so this, and in contrast, we see that there are pretty high returns in road infrastructure spending and education spending. So we see important variations across countries. And that's one of the lessons that we draw if we look at the collective insights from both the spending trends and the spending returns. Again, to summarize, we really have high returns to spending in R&D, both in absolute terms as well as comparatively. We have relatively high returns in total agriculture with variations across countries, but again, these do not match the impact that R&D spending has. Okay, so now we finally come to the third question. So certainly sort of a collective pointer that we see from the various data analyses is that there is a degree of underinvestment in agriculture, and even more pronounced in agriculture R&D. So this raises the question which we get at indirectly. So the direct question is, why is there underinvestment in agriculture? If you have such dramatic returns, why isn't it a no-brainer essentially to spend much more than we've seen on especially on R&D technology, but also in agriculture as a whole, and why are we instead seeing a decline? So we get at this, as I said, indirectly by examining what factors actually determine how public decision makers allocate public resources in agriculture and to agriculture. All right. So there is the sort of a fairly recent set of studies that I've undertaken, as well as other colleagues that you see here, that has really been directly provoked by the return to spending findings. And this work includes global reviews of evidence that does exist. It's fairly limited, actually, in agriculture, but whatever exists has been reviewed. Africa-level analysis focusing on research and development, as well as country case studies from Nigeria and from Mozambique. I'm going to just present the key findings that cut across these various studies. There's a quite rich set of findings, but I'll limit myself to some of the most consistent results that we see. The first is that visibility essentially matters. So what I mean by that is all public investments are not equal in terms of the level and the ability that citizens, and even specifically farmers, have to attribute these investments to actions and efforts that public leaders have undertaken. So this limited information that people have about what government actually is doing, in that some investments are clear, this is the effort of government, this is the effort of the Ministry of Agriculture, whereas other investments are practically not known or people are not aware of, leads public decision makers to direct resources precisely to those investments that are fairly easy for regular people to attribute back to the government's actions and to government's efforts. So this is really meant not in some kind of metaphoric sense exclusively of visibility, but also literal visibility. And this is seen in the case studies that we've undertaken as coming in many cases to the detriment of agriculture, because the number of agricultural investments are not as visible and seeable essentially to people as are, say, small-scale infrastructure, market stalls, buildings that are put up that folks can see. And what you see here in the brown is a quote from one of our respondents in one of the country case studies that really elucidates this very point, I think, quite pointedly. This also affects how resources are allocated by decision makers within agriculture. This is not only between ag and non-ag, but also within agriculture. So improving the skill set, the quality of extension agents, which I referenced earlier as an example of an outcome of expenditures, is something that can be very productive, but also very invisible. Quite in contrast to the provision, say, especially in the olden times when things were not all electronic, provision of vouchers for subsidized inputs, which may come in the form of a piece of paper with the logo of the Ministry of Agriculture or such on it. And these types of provisions are very clear that they are the efforts and the investments of public leaders. And they also then get much greater budgetary attention. We see that also in the example in the case of Mozambique, where despite tremendous underperformance of large-scale irrigation facilities that have come to complete disrepair, there's about 90% of irrigation funds go to large-scale irrigation, and small-scale, better functioning irrigation is under-allocated. Another key phenomenon that drives resource allocation is the time dimension of public spending. And here with time dimension, what I mean is the lag or the duration from the time that expenditures are incurred until outputs are delivered that are the result of these expenditures. So this has different pathways, why this actually matters. So long duration of the nature that I just described will tend to make these types of investments less attractive by public officials. So the first pathway is similar to the visibility phenomenon that I described earlier, because a long lag from spending to outputs will make it harder and more diffuse to actually attribute the expenditures or the investments to the politician's effort. The second point is that public officials are not in office forever. So in many cases, it will be a few years, or there are various durations, but the uncertainty about the duration that public leaders will be in office will mean that these long gestating investments will be less attractive because the chances that one can actually get political credit for the final benefits will be limited or will be less than quickly occurring outputs. And a final point on the lag dimension is that the long duration also increases risk, or essentially uncertainty about what kinds of returns will emerge from the spending, because a lot of things can happen in the interim. There can be external shocks, there can be fluctuations in crop prices, and all kinds of factors that could possibly undermine the outputs and the outcomes that emerge from this type of expenditures. And across all of these examples that I just gave, agricultural R&D, like I said earlier, is a clear example of a long gestating but highly productive investment that will be underinvested in because of these incentive issues. Finally, I want to describe some issues that also relate to information that I just described. So we find it, especially in the case of Nigeria, where we did quite intensive analysis of the budget process and the decision-making process on public expenditures, we see a mismatch between, on the one hand, the way agricultural expertise and information is distributed in the public sector, and on the other hand, the way influence over budgets are distributed. So what we find here is that chief executives that oversee government as a whole, are responsible to just have broad oversight across all sectors, actually end up having a fairly outsized and large role in making public expenditure decisions, not only to agriculture, but also on the minutiae and the details within agriculture. And in contrast, public officials that have agricultural expertise, because they have pronounced responsibility on the sector, have very little role to play on how resources should be allocated within the sector. In a very similar vein, when we look at the relationship or the distribution of information expertise on the one hand and budget influence on the other hand between levels of government, so tiers of government like local government and other levels of subnational, higher levels of national government, what we see is that officials at local government levels who have better detailed and granular information about specific agricultural conditions actually are not able to dispose of the funds that they are officially supposed to be able to allocate and to control, because higher tier governments who are more remote and removed from the specificities of the local jurisdictions are the ones who essentially call the shots. And what that actually has pointed to is that the various budget institutions and budget rules that are supposed to distribute the influence, the role, the control over resources in agriculture play a really limited role. So what is on the books is not often the way resources are allocated. I'll just end this particular finding with a graph or a table that demonstrates the difference or the poor alignment between information about agriculture on the one hand and influence on public budgets in agriculture on the other hand. It's a little bit involved, so maybe I won't go box by box, because I do want to come to some final conclusions. Some final conclusions on what can actually be done. What are the potential avenues to improve spending allocation for agriculture? So I want to, again, emphasize these are early thoughts and hopefully even points for discussion subsequently. I guess the first very general remark that I'd want to make is that I hope this body of work points to the need that we as analysts, as practitioners, need to kind of become more aware and cognizant of approaches that could make productive public investments more incentive compatible for those who are making these types of funding decisions. So let me go into some examples in this regard. So we talked about the role of visibility. So rather than treating the level of visibility of different investments as a given, which to some extent they may be, as sort of just part of the nature of different investments, we could be thinking in ways of how this visibility can be increased precisely for the kinds of public investments that are the most productive. Okay, so I just give here an example, again referring to extension agents, but I also want to point to one issue. So the African Union, as I mentioned earlier, has done some pretty high profile, I would argue fairly visible, perhaps not to farmers, but certainly to much of the development and agricultural community, visible benchmarking of country spending. That countries should try to reach 10% of agriculture share of total spending and 1% ag R&D intensity. So a question that we can kind of pose is, has this actually worked? Has this sort of exposure had an impact in increasing spending levels? It's obviously hard to answer this question rigorously. There are some indirect ways that this can be examined. Samuel Benin, an IFPRI researcher and PIM researcher, has, I'd say, indirectly looked at this, and maybe we can talk more about this. I may not have time to go through all the findings here, but that's the kind of question that I think we need to be asking. So another possible approach is to try to highlight, say, the current benefits of past long-term investments. So if we consider currently distributed improved crop varieties, these are the result of usually 10, 15, 7 years of hard work and hard expenditures in R&D. And so would it be helpful, and I'm posing this really more as a question, would it be possibly helpful to actually highlight these current benefits are the result of long-term spending in order to encourage current and future spending in the same direction? Finally, on this particular point, it would be worth thinking about how external support can actually directly try to incentivize domestic spending in R&D that is reliable, that is consistent and steady, and also obviously adequate. So this is a bit more than just thinking about supplementing domestic spending with donor spending, but really thinking about rewarding government, high levels of government spending through, say, matching grants. Okay, so let me say a bit more on information. So there's current work that's ongoing by Katrina Kosek, also an IFPRI and PIM researcher, and Leonard Wanchikon at Princeton, that is examining the role of information and provision of appropriate information to improve public service delivery, both in the composition and the choice of public services, as well as in the quality. And related and similar work that is done by the World Bank, by Stuti Kemal. This body of work is not focused exclusively on agriculture, but I think it has important lessons for agriculture that we can be thinking about. So what role would improving the information base that farmers and other rural citizens have about what actually the government is doing, what public resources it's allocating to agriculture, what goods and services come out of these expenditures, and maybe most ambitiously, what impact these goods and services have on the welfare of those to whom we're providing the information. So this line of research, I think, needs to be undertaken specifically with regard to agriculture. Much of this work has been done in other sectors, and I think there is scope for more in this direction. Okay. So I want to perhaps close by way of thinking about future avenues by talking a little bit about farmers' associations. So there's been a lot of both research as well as actual interventions to strengthen agricultural associations, cooperatives, farmers groups, etc., in order to improve their collective action capacity, often with the idea in mind of, their strengthening their bargaining power vis-a-vis market actors, helping them to get market price information, etc., etc. But I think we should be thinking about also their bargaining power, to use that word in quotation marks, vis-a-vis the public sector. So could strengthening their collective action capacity actually improve their ability to more effectively and powerfully demand the needed public expenditures, public investments, and goods and services they would benefit from in agriculture? So thinking beyond sort of just the market and extension provision realms. I know I'm very soon out of time, so I think I will end here and just close to mention that there are a number of references listed here on the on the slides for those who want to get more detail. And thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much, Tewodaj. That was very interesting. We received a number of comments and questions. Let me just start. Do you want by there was just a couple of quick questions, I think, on the data that you presented. One was just to confirm whether the numbers you were putting in, looking at trends over time, were based on real expenditure versus nominal. So that was one question. Then there was some other questions about the noting that you were using a lot of different ratios, but they wanted to get a better sense of, well, what was happening in terms of absolute public expenditure in agriculture or ag R&D versus the ratios. So maybe just those two questions first.
Sure. Okay, so on the first point, whether these were real or nominal, these are actually real values, but I do want to mention, of course, that precisely, I actually did not present absolute levels where the concern would be even larger if one were just to present, say, nominal values and real values that tell a very different picture. All of what I've presented were normalized expenditures, either normalized by total spending or normalized by agricultural GDP. So, so in a way, I'm, I guess, addressing the two things here. But just to say a little bit more on the second, absolute levels of expenditures in agriculture have actually seen an increase, if I remember correctly. And again, you've seen actually a lot of the fluctuations, right? Both in R&D, but even much more in total agriculture. So it's hard to say sort of with a distinct, with sort of a level of definiteness about increases or decreases, because they do go up and down. But there has been a long-term increase, even in real terms. But this increase, I mean, what these relative results that I showed, the normalized results show, is that the increase in agricultural spending have been far outstripped by increases in total spending and increases in ag GDP. So we know that ag GDP has increased in Africa, especially, certainly not in the past, not in the 80s and 90s, but in the 2000s. And so, yes, so there has been an increase, but again, we would want to be thinking about. I think I presented relative terms because I think that those are perhaps a bit more relevant. But yes.
Okay, good, thank you. In terms of your presentation of the results on returns to the investments in ag R&D and ag as a total, I guess there was a question. Was wondering whether there was, this justification, perhaps from the governments for reducing it. Could it be because the returns on investment are declining over time after a stock of investments have been made in the past, and vis-a-vis other sectors? And so that was one question. And then another observation was, you noted that the returns to ag R&D were generally higher than the returns to overall spending in ag in a number of cases. And the question was posed was, could that be a result of, say, selection bias, that people target those ag R&D investments in places where it's likely to pay off, as opposed to the case for general ag expenditures, which have to be kind of done in all kinds of circumstances and cases and countries. So those are the two questions around that one.
Okay, thanks. So on the first issue, whether there's an argument to be made that let me just recap and make sure I understand the question, whether there's an argument to be made that, investments should actually be declining because returns are declining. We certainly don't have any evidence here. Certainly what I've presented, I also haven't seen evidence in Africa on the changes over time in returns to spending. So just to be very clear, because I know I threw up a lot of graphs and trend lines, all the declines that you've seen were spending trends, so actual expenditures normalized in different ways, right? The returns are not shown. We don't have them. That it's very data intensive to be able to show changes over time in returns to spending. So what you see are just the returns to spending, with the data that are there. So we don't have any evidence that returns have actually declined. So therefore, I don't think that there would be any argument to be made here that that investments should actually decline. Just one, I think another aspect of this question was saying, have they declined, or how do these returns compare to non-agricultural investments? So that's clearly what we've seen. Again, these are certainly some country case studies, so we should be, of course, cautious. But what we have seen in some of the country case studies, as far as R&D is concerned, is that it has really outstripped the returns to road infrastructure, which are also really high. I mean, really, I didn't spend that much time to talk about the numeric values. They're also very high, but they have certainly outstripped other types of investments. So the argument that it's low compared to other investments doesn't at least emerge from the body of work that I talked about. The second point, I think, was whether there's a selection bias in R&D. So investments in R&D are undertaken in those locations where they pay off. I guess I'm not sure if this is a question that is meant sort of as a question of external validity, if you will, of the study. So are we only showing those countries where R&D investments really pay off, and that's why they made them, and those are where we see the returns? If we only did the work in other countries, we may see something else, or or if it is meant as an internal remark. I think it's a fair question to raise. At least one, there's no clear refutal that there may not be selection in where R&D is invested in. I haven't presented any results, even though there are some from ASTI, I believe, that show the locations and the types of R&D expenditures undertaken that would have outstripped this particular presentation. But I think that even if there were some level of selection, I think it's important to first point out that, I mean, what we see here from these peer-reviewed work is the level of returns are really large. I mean, they're quite dramatic, such that it's a bit hard to imagine that if we remove the selection, then these returns would go down to zero. So, but I think it's a fair remark.
Okay, good. I have, I think, 3 more types of questions here to try to see if we can cover, and that we still have time. So although the focus was on agriculture vis-a-vis other types of spending in terms of the impacts, it was one of the listeners had said, well, even though it's you can find data on the different sectors and look at that, what happens on the ground is that there needs to be a balance of different kinds of spending on the ground to make things work, because they work in complement to each other. So have you done any analysis, or has anyone else tried to look at the balance of spending and how that might impact on income or poverty reduction?
Well, I mean, in a way, so especially the country studies shown, there is of course an existing balance of expenditures on the basis of which these studies are undertaken, right? So there will be some kind of composition, and given the composition, given the spending patterns that prevail, the shares allocated to, say, road infrastructure, to energy, to health, education, and R&D, etc., and agriculture, given this composition, so the studies show results given existing compositions. So I think one thing that maybe is always important to point out for these types of marginal returns type studies is they don't point to what the shares should be versus what they are, right? They're only an indication of, on the margin, where returns are fairly high or zero, or positive or not so high, right? So they will be suggestive of how resources should be allocated on the margin again, given the existing levels of composition and allocation. So I hope this addresses the question.
Right. Then there was a related question again about kind of the scope of the analyses that have been undertaken. There was a couple comments about the private sector, because we know in addition to public expenditure, there's a lot more spending that comes in from the private sector in many countries. And so a question came in to know maybe conceptually and empirically to what extent does public expenditure sometimes crowd out or crowd in other private expenditure, and how and given that public expenditure effectiveness may be dependent upon private investment as well, it complements to. So there are questions where how could that, was that handled, or can that be handled in such analysis?
Yeah, no, I think that's especially in a forward-looking way. It's really important to be thinking about what the role of private and is this pertaining to R&D, or is this pertaining?
This was pertaining, well, not necessarily R&D. It could just looking at public expenditures as a whole, but and in general, kind of trying to interpret your results of looking at returns to public expenditure, and so whether you could control for or also include private measures of private expenditure.
Yeah. So nonetheless, let me first speak to R&D, and then I'll maybe make it more general. So. Certainly in the case of, since my presentation was very Africa-centric, I'll carry on with focusing on Africa. In the case of the region, first of all, private investment in R&D does exist, but it's really small. Now, we don't have very good systematic data, I have to say. So the Ag Science and Technology Indicators, ASTI, collects data on government expenditures, higher education expenditures, much of which are public universities, and nonprofit sector expenditures, which are actually fairly small compared to the other two. So that is what this focuses on. But certainly from other data that is available, it's clear that R&D investments from the private sector are, first of all, really small still. I mean, where they exist, they tend to be quite concentrated in a few countries like South Africa, to some extent Kenya, but otherwise are very marginal. They're also sort of focused on fairly niche, high-value crops, not on major food and staple crops. Clearly, there are various reasons for this. The poor intellectual property rights environment in Africa is not particularly conducive for private sector investments, and a number of other factors. So we are really talking about a landscape in which, private R&D is so small as to, it's so small as to be considered, I would say, marginal, unfortunately. But let me just say a few words about the general relationship between public and private investments. So the analyses presented, and also other work not presented here, is accounting for the way that public expenditures affect ultimately private actors, whether these are farmers, other agents in the agricultural space, and their investments as well. So I think there are a couple of studies, not to my knowledge in the African context, but there are a couple of studies in some Asian countries that more directly and explicitly analyze the impact of public investment on private investment, the extent to which there's crowd in and crowd out. What I recall from that body of work is that it is very mixed. So there are certain types of public expenditures that literally crowd out private investment. It can be seen in the data where data exists, and other cases where it actually crowds in. So the jury's a little bit out, but ultimately this issue will be determined by it's not, one can't say this in a very global way. It depends on, are investments being undertaken on public goods, things that are particularly necessary for businesses, for agricultural, commercial farmers, etc., that things that they need in order to be productive, that they will not have the incentives themselves to invest in, like the examples I gave: extension, energy, roads, etc. So.
We had a couple other questions now looking at some of the political economy factors. You had mentioned that the governments are interested in short-term and visible types of outputs. There was a comment that was reflecting on the fact that in some African countries, actually, at least at the presidential level, they stay in power for a long time. And so in those countries, would they also still have short-termism, or maybe you can explain what happens?
Yeah, it's a very fair, a very understandable question. So, I mean, I think one one thing I would certainly like to do is to look at this question quantitatively, empirically, in a more systematic way. But just to speak conceptually to what underlies this question. One thing that I did not present and go into a lot of detail on is there are a number of other incentives that we'd want to worry about or want to think about when we talk about the incentives of public officials, politicians, to undertake the necessary expenditures. We talked so far about, you know, in a context in which there needs to be some degree of catering to the populations and some concern about electoral processes, and how certain distortions that emerge from information asymmetries can result in sort of the suboptimal investments that I talked about. Certainly when we're talking about those who are in power for a long time and they you know, are in a governance environment where they do not have to be, say, as concerned about electoral pressures or other pressures, frankly, from the population, there are other incentive problems we have to worry about at the same time. So why bother? Why invest to strengthen smallholder and other citizens' livelihoods? So just to put it out there that there are a number of incentives that can work in various directions, but especially when we are talking about cases where power is held in ways that do not depend on citizens' approval, then that also raises the question of do these leaders have the incentives to seek approval at all? In which case, that can also lead to poor investments.
Right. Are there any particular vested interest groups or other powers to be in the countries that are particularly opposed to ag R&D and ag expenditures that you've encountered in your work?
So this was one of the remarks I had toward the end, and I didn't go into detail, but I think we do want to think about those types of institutions that are domestic that have a long-term interest in receiving the appropriate investments from the public sector, not only R&D for that matter, but other types of investments that are there to stay, that are there for the long haul. So if we think of, for example, producer organizations, and I'm not talking about the small farmer groups consisting of 20 farmers or whatever, right? I'm talking about, say, in Nigeria, you have the All Farmers Association of Nigeria, or AFAN, in other countries. They come in different forms. These are often umbrella organizations that are stable, that are around irrespective of changes in government, that have fairly consistent leadership. These types of domestic institutions are precisely the ones that I think we need to be thinking more about, giving them the tools and the opportunity and working with them so that they actually can exert the necessary pressure and effort to change the outlook of either elected or other political leaders that may have sort of a problem of short-termism. So there are other kinds of organizations as well, but let's think not only of public officials who are in power through whatever means, but also think of sort of long-term stable institutions that advocate on behalf of farmers. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you. We're just at the end of the hour, so that's just perfect. So there may have been one or two small comments, I think, that we'll share with you later, and
Okay.
we'll share with you all the comments and the people, and you may want to engage with them individually. But I wanted to thank you once again for the seminar. It was very interesting and generated a lot of comments and questions. So thanks to Tewodaj, thanks to all the listeners, and we are planning to have two more, I think, in 2017, perhaps at the end of October. We will be getting back to everyone shortly with that announcement. So thanks once again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And just to add to this, that the recording of this webinar will be uploaded on our website, pim.cgir.org, shortly, today or tomorrow. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.